Alrighty then, and welcome along to the Cult of Nick. So we've got two pieces for you on today's show. First of all, reaction to the awful business in Paris, the attacks of the 13th, Friday the 13th. We have someone who initially I was going to book onto the main show, onto the John Gaunt show that I produce at the moment, that I've mentioned to you, cult member, over the last few weeks, months, whatever it is. I'm not even sure. You know, this podcast gets uploaded as much as I can, as regularly as it can be. But if you're a regular listener, you'll be familiar with the fact that I've changed job. I've got a job now where I'm producing the John Gaunt show, and that means I'm arranging guests and that kind of business. And Catherine wrote a great blog entry, and so I speak to her about that. I link across to it as well from the main page, thecultofnick.co.uk. And on a personal level, I feel almost exactly the same as I did after the Charlie Hebdo thing. And where all this is leading, I don't know. It's not good, is it? It's not good. I'll give you more thoughts after we do Catherine's piece. And then we have a cracking interview that I've been dying to release to you. We did it last week. And it's with Robbie Graham. And it's on the subject of UFOs and their depictions in films and the media. The conversation really, really continues to cook. And by the end, I was blown away. My brain was fried, actually. Robbie Graham is a great contributor. And the interesting thing about him, I think, is that once you really get pushing him, you can get some incredible stuff out of him. So make sure you listen to that. And then I'll give you some thoughts about the world in general, as is usually the case. And that's how that's going to work. Oh, by the way, we've shifted this podcast to another podcast provider called Acast. Details about that at the back end of the show as well. Let's have a little listen to what Catherine had to say then. We have a contributor on the podcast today who I came across in my duties producing the John Gaunt show. And obviously we've been reacting to the unbelievably terrible news of what's happened in Paris. And Catherine was one of the guests that we had lined up for John's show. And I asked her if she wouldn't mind also speaking to us about what's happened in Paris here on the podcast. She wrote a fantastic blog entry that I strongly recommend you read. I will link to it. So if you go to the main site, thecultofnick.co.uk, you will find a link across to her blog entry. Basically, she's taking a year. Well, she's on her year abroad. She's studying French and linguistics at I think it's at Oxford, and she's written a piece about what happened to her on the 13th of November. Let's welcome her onto the airwaves. Catherine, how are you? Are you all right?
Yep, good considering. Yeah.
So you're in Paris at the moment, right?
Yes.
So let's have a look. I've got this blog entry here and we'll pick it up from here. It says, on the Paris attacks at around 10:30 p.m. on Friday the 13th of November, I was on my way to buy chips when I clocked that too many people were on their phones. My dad told me about a similarly unsettling experience he had in an HMV in London on the 7th of July 2005. So obviously something had happened. Do you want to take it over from there, Catherine? What had happened?
Well, I mean, obviously the attacks had happened pretty much an hour before I'd gone out, or roughly, I think. And I think it was already starting to hit the waves, you know, people getting their phones out and, you know, not just being on the phone. They were, you know, on the spot. They weren't multitasking. They were on the phone and they were all a bit anxious and... yeah, that was really detectable. I went and got my chips anyway, but no, I went home and I read all about it, and there was some sort of similar kind of fear going on in the apartment in front of me, I noticed. You could see in all the windows people were sort of either on phones or sat by the window on Facebook. You could sort of see the blue bar at the top of their screens and things. It was definitely a bit of a frenzy that was really, really detectable, even though I wasn't very close, you know, probably about a mile away or so.
So you're there, you're in Paris, and Paris is under attack. What was the feeling like as you were getting information from social media? Because I often wonder if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It could potentially spread misinformation and panic, no?
Oh, yeah, God. I was getting messages from people who literally hadn't had anything to do with me for years, but they'd been reading about this and 150 out of a huge population in Paris who were affected. The chances were pretty slim that I was, but people were still concerned because it looked huge. And actually, at the time, we were all afraid because it was, the criminals were still at large. So there was me just sort of waiting by the window all night thinking, God, we don't know anything about when this is going to end, if it will or whatever. And everyone on social media was in the same page there. So, yeah, no, that was pretty bad. They, all my friends were genuinely concerned that I would be there, and I wasn't, but it was still detectable from where I was, probably because of all the social media.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm looking at the blog entry in question, and you mention that you're not the sort of person that particularly follows the news. I quote, "I know nothing about the Middle East. I close the tab. I continue with my day, making a snack or deciding I want a haircut or something. I'm not proud of being that person." You say, well, do you know what? I kind of am impressed by that, because I'm not sure watching the news does you any good, and getting drawn into all these things does you any good. Were you... kind of sum up the shock, because some people listening to the podcast will have been aware of the fact there was a situation going on and that this kind of thing was a question of when, not if. Give us your perspective a bit on that.
Well, the main fear for me was just, we're so used to, on social media, hearing Middle Eastern crisis, whatever, tragedies that are far away from us, very far removed from our way of life, from our understanding of the world. We're used to being safe. We're not used to being threatened, unless we read a little bit too much, and then conspiracies really do seep into our conscious. But not with me. I'm not used to being afraid. And when something like that hits the Western world, people out having dinner, people just going to see a concert, this sort of thing is not supposed to happen. It's a collision of worlds. It's a collision of tragedies happening far, far away with our safe little life of going out on a Friday night. And that's what was shocking about it.
So since the attacks, what's the atmosphere in Paris like for you, an English person, hanging out with one of our closest allies, the French, right?
Yeah. Oh, it's ridiculous. I mean, so for the most part, things have been pretty much as you'd expect. So there's definitely a bigger police presence, army presence. A lot of places were closed the day or next 2 days after, parks, museums, department stores. And there certainly weren't enough people outside. So there was a definite palpable kind of fear and unease in the air. And then the other thing that was shocking, the most unfortunate sort of effect I've noticed, is probably just people are a bit more skittish about foreigners. So I was walking with a friend in the centre of Paris. We were speaking English together, and then this bloke noticed us and said something along the lines of, "Oh, enjoy Paris while it's still here, tourists." It was just, xenophobia, not just Islamophobia, which is sad enough,
Right, I see. So having a go at you for speaking? Well, I guess that's a common French trait, though,
I think it was just because he clocked we were English and felt a sudden sort of, oh, these foreigners, this isn't the right time for them to be here. We're dealing with the aftermath of a catastrophe and Paris needs time to itself. I can completely understand that, but it was definitely just this sort of aggression and this sort of, oh, we're not proud of things at the moment, we're afraid of foreigners.
Wow, this is interesting stuff. So am I right in understanding that there was an attempt at a minute's silence that went awry as well?
Well, yeah, so for me in particular, what I experienced of it, I happened to be on the tube at the time, and the train stopped, and over the system they said, "Oh, we're having a minute's silence." Only in French, though, so there were a couple of tourists in front of me still chatting, still just completely unaware and thinking, oh, the train stopped, whatever, it'll come back up. And then this woman next to me and a couple of other blokes behind started shouting at them, completely in French. I mean, that's all they can do, I suppose. But it was so brutal. It was just, shut up, you don't understand, oh God. And, it was awful. And then, yeah, these guys were shut up, but probably for the rest of the journey. Bless them, it was terrible.
So I wonder...
I mean, obviously, it's understandable, you need some respect, you need a minute's silence and stuff, but, it was just unfortunate, and people are very angry at the moment, and that's really hot in the air.
I wonder, you're only in the immediate aftermath of these attacks. Has it made you consider, coming back? Because, you're from the UK originally. This is the kind of stuff that'd have me packing my bags and coming home, I think.
Yeah, it has been kind of a sad sort of vibe to be in, and I have thought about, initially I thought about doing Christmas in Paris. I thought that would have been quite scenic and quite exciting, but yet I have thought it would be probably more friendly to be at home. But at the same time, obviously, this is another social media issue. You'll get in a bit of fear of, what if something happened in London now? That's all over the place on the news. Threats elsewhere. So in some ways, is it safer here? Maybe it is at the moment, in the midst of one. Is it going to strike here again? I don't know.
Because you're in a country that's now declared war.
Yeah, essentially.
Which is, and, and from the sounds of it, the character of the nation is changing a little with some of the tensions that you're talking about there. Do you think that's the kind of thing that would kind of die down there, or are you already playing it down? Well,
I'm not sure. I think for the most part, so this is some aggression I've seen, but there's also been a lot of coming together and probably a lot of peaceful wishes as well. There are candles on the balconies on the apartment opposite me. You see lots of, I don't know if you've seen that image of the peace sign with the Eiffel Tower imposed on it. That's been drawn in chalks all over the pavements, all over the place. So it's strange because obviously the François Hollande speech was very much, we're declaring war, we're not having this. But I'm sure that's not everybody's agenda here. So the tragedy is, if another thing strikes, it's more innocent people who are going to get it,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then I'm wondering also, I guess, final question on this really. What about the response, the policing, that kind of stuff? We've seen some pictures here in the United Kingdom on the front pages of the papers of police tooled up and looking like RoboCop and that kind of thing. And I wonder, have you seen that? And if you have, how does it make you feel to see kind of a heavy police presence? Or is it not as it's being reported? Is it just kind of like normal, for want of a better word, in Paris?
No, you do see a big police presence in certain places. I was in a taxi yesterday, and there was definitely a lot around the centre, Saint-Germain. There was a lot of police around there. So, there's definitely a presence. And obviously, as an English person, seeing guns around isn't, we're not accustomed to that. And that is really that's frightening in itself. But, I'm sure a lot of French people see some security in that as well. You could take it either way.
What about you, though? I'm asking you how you take it. Because I remember at the after the riots, 2011, right? I remember seeing our British police tooled up and looking like RoboCop. And it was the strangest thing, Catherine, because although I intellectually felt like I should be reassured by that sight, emotionally, it made me even more frightened. How does it affect you to see that kind of military-style policing?
Well, exactly. It is frightening. I think for me, it is just frightening. So on the one hand, it looks like a necessary sort of, not evil, but you know what I mean, it's a necessary sort of measure. But while it may make some people feel safe, it makes me feel reminded that actually we're on a bit of a red alert sort of situation. You walk past any tourist monument or just wherever in Paris, they're there. And, this isn't, it's not the Paris you see on the postcards, is it? It's just quite sad.
Catherine, listen, thanks for spending some time with us, and obviously our thoughts go out to the immediate victims of what's happened, and you make that clear in your blog entry as well, so it's worth saying. But I hope you stay safe personally, and keep in touch with us, and I hope everything goes okay. Listen, really great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Okay, before we dive into the main interview then, just going to do a little bit of a plug. Hope you don't mind this. Obviously, as I mentioned to you before, I'm producing the John Gaunt Show, and this is my job. I work in radio, and that's what I do. And I've worked with all sorts of different people in the past. Often I work front of house as a presenter, but I have worked behind the scenes as well. I'm quite good at producing people, actually, and telling them how it works and this kind of stuff. And I've just got to give you a plug for a guy who I'm getting on with really well. He used to be an editor of most of the major tabloid newspapers in the country, like the News of the World. He worked there, the Sunday People, the Bear. He's a Fleet Street, I wouldn't say he was a Fleet Street hack, I would say he's a Fleet Street legend. Neil the Wolfman Wallace. Now, here's the interesting thing about this, and here's why I think it's worth a plug on the Cult of Nick. This guy has had his life turned inside out by an investigation into him over phone hacking. And it's so interesting to hear how he has changed. He's one of these people who was previously of the opinion that if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. He was coming from that angle. He was pushing this idea that we should trust the government, trust the police, all this kind of stuff. And then what happened? Well, they turned on him. That's right, that's what happened. They turned on him. They a dawn raid to work out if he'd been phone hacking. Do you need a dawn raid for phone hacking? For drug dealing, maybe. Protection rackets, that kind of stuff. Catching people unawares, that's fair enough. But phone hacking, you understand what phone hacking is, don't you? It's checking someone's voicemail remotely when they haven't put a password on that facility. Did you know that voicemails can be checked remotely? Yeah, not many people who own a mobile phone do, but I can't remember off the top of my head. I think you press star. Actually, I'm not going to I don't want to get arrested for phone hacking. And yeah, for the record, I've never hacked a phone. I've never checked anyone's voicemail remotely, which is what they're talking about when they talk about phone hacking. You'd think it was, like some sort of more advanced, like listening devices or something like that. Not at all. That's all they're talking about, remote checking of someone's voicemail. And this guy, Neil Wallace, Neil the Wolfman Wallace, famous on Fleet Street, called the Wolfman because he gets his teeth into stories and doesn't rest until those stories come to ground. Rarely gets them spiked as well. He's a very good journalist, but the point is that he's just gone completely off message. I can't recommend his podcast enough. I think it's great. He monologues, he talks about the news. You won't always agree with him. I certainly don't always agree with him on everything, but it's really interesting to hear a guy with a contacts book to die for and life experience that goes way beyond my own. And he's had dinner with most of the major prime ministers of the United Kingdom for the last 15, 20 years, whatever it is. He's really well connected and he's gone so off message. I can't recommend it enough. Have a little listen to the Neil Wallace podcast. All right, I hope you don't mind me plugging my own work there. I just thought I'd chuck it in. It helped me enormously if you did listen to that and subscribe and download and stuff, because obviously it means the show would have more listeners. But thought I'd mention it. Right, let's dive into this conversation now. And we've had Robbie Graham on the show before. This interview, though, is the mother of all interviews with him. This blows me away, some of the stuff we get into. And have a little listen. Robbie Graham, written a book, Silver Screen Saucers. I'm going to draw your attention, though, to the subheading, Sorting Fact from Fantasy in Hollywood's UFO Movies. That's right. Some of the major films you've seen are actually based on real-world events. There's substance behind the UFO myth, which has been dished out as fantasy. What does that mean? Let's get Robbie Graham on and let's see what he thinks. Robbie, thanks for taking the time to join us, man.
Hey, Nick. Good to speak to you again.
So, interesting subject this, obviously. Where do we even start? Let's start here. The idea that Hollywood has some sort of arrangement with the intelligence services, most people would laugh that out of court, whereas all they need to do is go online and check into these things, and of course that happens, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The relationship between Hollywood and Washington is no secret. The relationship in particular between the Department of Defense and specifically the Air Force and Hollywood dates back many decades, but actually was really solidified, I guess, and concretized in the 1980s with the Top Gun movie, starring Tom Cruise, and this was a film that was really geared towards naval recruitment and was encouraged and backed by the US Navy, and it received the full cooperation of the Pentagon. And when the movie was released, you had naval recruitment officers at various cinema theatres around the country actively recruiting, young men. And as a result of this, naval recruitment in the weeks and months following the release of Top Gun was boosted 500%. So it was hugely successful in that regard. And the relationship between the DoD and Hollywood is such that Hollywood often approaches various branches of the US government, and particularly the military, for action films and thrillers and things like that. And they request their advice, their technical advice, to make sure that what's being depicted on screen is accurate, authentic. But also they request the use of personnel, troops, tanks, planes, things to increase the authenticity of what's being depicted on screen. So you can create these things through special effects nowadays. But prior to the 1990s, you really couldn't. You needed hardware to do it, and so it was easier just to go to the military to get this directly, and then you get the support. But in exchange for this, the Department of Defense requests access to, or rather demands access to, the screenplay. And at any stage during the production process, the DoD can review and change the content of a script, and essentially they can really inform the overarching narrative, and they can tweak it towards their own national security concerns. They can push their own agenda. And again, as I say, the underlying and open goal is to boost recruitment and retention of personnel. However, when you've got access to a script, you can essentially, as I say, you can do all sorts of things with it.
That's really,
really
interesting, isn't it?
So that's the relationship. But of course, and there have been many films that have benefited, kind of benefited from DoD involvement. But there are also many that have had CIA involvement as well, which is a little bit more subversive in its nature and a little bit more covert, I guess. And of course, many films nowadays are about aliens, alien invasion, and some of these films have also received cooperation from the Department of Defense and had their narratives tweaked as well.
So let's just come in here then. The CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, connected, of course, to the Department of Defense, the DoD. You can understand the sort of official explanation for all of this. Like you say, they're using equipment. It's a quick way of getting your film done. You can get, a tank shot in the background and all that kind of stuff. All of that very much makes sense. But as soon as people start talking about an alliance between Hollywood and, the CIA / the American government, there's going to be a certain proportion of people, a large number of them listening to this podcast, because, with a post-conspiracy theory podcast, we've been through the rabbit hole, come out the other side, and we've heard most of the great big conspiracy theories that are floating around. Because there's two words in my head, Robbie, and I want you to comment on this: Stanley Kubrick. Everybody alleges that there was some sort of involvement between the CIA and Stanley Kubrick, who hangs around in these circles. Go on forums, you can find all sorts of rumours to that effect.
There are many rumours, nothing concrete, there's no smoking gun there. Now, Kubrick, it's no secret that Kubrick had a interest in secret societies, in the notion of conspiracy, in government. He was a hugely intelligent guy, and anyone who knows anything about Kubrick will know that he spent a lot of his life as a recluse, essentially, and he sent out a number of assistants to do his research for him, and he would spend literally years, researching a topic for a film before he would even put pen to paper and start writing the screenplay. He wanted to know everything about that subject before he even began to explore it as a movie. And he's a genius. And the rumors are that the technologies that Kubrick developed for the filming of 2001: A Space Odyssey, the special effects, for example, and the way that he shot those moon sequences in particular, were utilized after the fact by the US government to help stage the 1969 moon landings, and that this was allegedly done with the cooperation of Kubrick, and that Kubrick was, instrumental in doing it. Now, again, they're rumours. There's absolutely no there's nothing you can put your finger on to prove any of that. I really don't like speculating. There's so much speculation in this field, in UFOs in particular. The whole field is almost defined by speculation. I mean, it's a farce. And so I really try not to indulge in too much speculation, because it just serves no purpose other than to just fuel even more groundless conspiracy theories. Yeah. What I would say, having put that in place, what I would say is that, do I think the Americans went to the moon in 1969? Almost certainly, yes. Do I think that some of the photographic documentation of that event was faked after the fact for publicity reasons? Almost certainly, yes. So the two don't have to be mutually exclusive. You've gone to the moon and you're in a harsh extraterrestrial environment. Your photographic equipment isn't necessarily going to perform as required. And let's face it, the whole moon mission in itself was a publicity stunt. I mean, that's what it was. It was a political exercise. And if you don't come back with some pretty startling pictures, then people are going to be really disappointed by the whole affair. So this is something that is defined in popular culture by the images that are burned into our brain. And so NASA was very well aware of that. Now, it's quite likely that photographic documentation of the actual event was poor. And then after the fact, they had to stage some photographs and even footage. Now, staging photographs is one thing, footage is more difficult. And if you did have to stage footage in a kind of a zero-gravity environment or low-gravity environment, and you had to create some kind of a lunarscape, there are only a few people in the world you could go to, and Kubrick would obviously be one of them. And so is there any substance at all to the idea that Kubrick may have been involved in helping to stage footage after the fact, not to mask the idea that, not to mask the fact that there was no moon landing, but just simply to kind of give more polish to the actual photo, to the actual mission itself. I think there is possibly some substance to that. Kubrick was a hugely secretive guy right up until his death, and so I think there's something possibly to that, but people confuse the two. I think people conflate the two. They would suggest that simply because there's photographic fakery after the fact indicates that there was no mission at all, and I don't believe that's the case.
I wonder, though, I mean, in your book, when you speak about Kubrick, one of the things that is in the air around the time of his beginning, well, he made the film, of course, 2001, is this idea of what's called the ancient astronauts theory. Now, in terms of credibility, I would say that is probably the theory that has the most credibility in terms of extraterrestrial involvement with this planet. And am I right in thinking you had Chariots of the Gods going around, and then Kubrick, was he inspired or instructed to make a film with a similar theme?
Absolutely no evidence for that at all that I've seen. This was based on Arthur C. Clarke's Sentinel book, and Kubrick and Clarke co-wrote the screenplay for the movie. Mm-hmm. There's no evidence for it at all. Now, the ancient astronaut theory, don't forget, this wasn't the first film to explore the idea of ancient astronauts. In my book, I look at a number of television products and film products which predate 2001: A Space Odyssey, which directly explore the idea of ancient alien visitation of Earth. So this wasn't something that was new in 2001: A Space Odyssey. And in fact, the idea of ancient alien visitation goes back to the 1800s. And was already being explored in fiction literature as well, in H.P. Lovecraft and other authors throughout the 19th and 20th century. So this isn't a new idea; it's an old idea. 2001 was probably the first major film to explore it in a central way, in a way that was central to its plot. And then, of course, the ancient astronaut genre or subgenre really exploded again in the 1990s with the arrival of Stargate, but then it died away again, and then it wasn't until recent years, really, with the arrival of the TV show Ancient Aliens from 2010 for the History Channel, that really kind of pushed this idea of ancient alien visitation into popular culture and made a bit of a farce of it, really, and it became a meme, and South Park then spoofed the idea of it, and you've had the Thor movie and the sequel to Thor, and you've had Prometheus, which explores ancient astronaut theory. All of these films are tapping into existing or pre-existing ufological debates, ufological ideas, and that's been the trend, really, that defines the relationship between Hollywood and Washington, going back, between Hollywood and ufology, going back to the birth of the phenomenon and of the genre, the modern phenomenon rather. And so what you've had is Hollywood acting in a parasitic fashion towards ufology. These ideas, these debates about UFOs and alien visitation, and the terminology and the research already existed at a fringe kind of subcultural level. And then various people within the creative industries, they latched onto some of these ideas and they used them in their plots for movies and books, and particularly in movies. And the result has been the popularization of these otherwise fringe ideas. And then the result of the popularization of these fact-based ideas is that these fact-based ideas have become fictionalized. And that's not to suggest that they weren't fiction in the first place, but simply that they were fact-based. So that's kind of the angle that I've taken in my book. It's both cultural and conspiratorial. I'm interested in the relationship between Hollywood and Washington, and the extent to which Washington has kind of managed public perceptions of this UFO phenomenon through entertainment media. But also I'm interested in just this natural cultural process whereby Hollywood has shaped our perceptions and expectations of this really bizarre phenomenon, and the nature of this relationship. And as I say, it's symbiotic, but it's also parasitic now as well. People have the assumption that the UFO subculture thrives and feeds off Hollywood, but actually it's really the opposite.
Yeah, the picture I get from your book actually seems to be that there's a kind of an ongoing dialogue between our mass popular culture and ufology, and this ongoing dialogue seems to occasionally excite the ufologists to think that what they're saying must be true because there's a film about it, and they can't distinguish between that being fiction and their factual experiences, because that's what they're saying has happened to them. You've got that kind of dialogue going that way. But then the other way, and, again, this is just from reading your book, it does seem to me that ongoing dialogue has managed to subvert the UFO discourse in some way. And I guess that's what I'm talking about with Kubrick. You've got this ancient aliens thing, which, like I say, periodically pops up every now and then, and you can argue it goes back, well, to the ancient aliens landing amongst us thousands of years ago, perhaps. But that kind of meme reemerges in the 70s, and then you get a film that sort of appropriates it and takes it over. And then, as you say, it's come up again recently. And then big Hollywood films like the Indiana Jones film, for example, has got the ancient aliens in there, and like you detail in your book, loads of other films. They suddenly try to appropriate that narrative, and I'm wondering which way round it goes. It doesn't have to go just one way, does it? It doesn't have to go one way.
No, it doesn't. And as I do point out in the book as well, while in terms of broad trend, people ask what influences what, which came first, the chicken or the egg, and broadly speaking, you can say that the UFO phenomenon came first. The UFO phenomenon predates cinematic and media depictions of it, because of course it predates media, or it predates electronic and digital media. The phenomenon in its modern phase began in 1947, and the first UFO movie was 1950, and you had some engagement with it in some serials in around 1948-49, but clearly the phenomenon predated the actual depictions of it by at least a year or two. So broadly speaking, you can say that the phenomenon predates the depictions of it, but what you can say in certain circumstances is that, for example, a film or a TV show has, or would appear to have, directly influenced a strain of thought within the UFO community. So the ideas of David Icke, for example, which themselves are not original, but taken from people like Zecharia Sitchin and a whole host of other researchers going back several decades, this grand conspiracy narrative that's been spun by David Icke most popularly is identifiable or is traceable to TV products, for example, such as V, which was 1983, 1984, where you've got reptilian beings disguised as human elites, basically, arriving on Earth and offering to better mankind. They are not what they appear, and they are literally flesh-eating monsters. And of course, this is actually one of the core ideas that's been pushed by David Icke and others, not just David Icke. But these ideas are actually really fleshed out at least a couple of decades before David Icke started to write about them, at least a decade before he started to write about them. He started to write about these things in around 1990, mid-90s. And as I say, the V TV show was the early 1980s. Now, of course, the V TV show itself was not original, and it drew its ideas from elsewhere, from literature. But it's very, very difficult, as you can see, to trace things back to their root, to trace things back to their source, because literature ideas predate those which are evident in cinema, because, of course, literature vastly predates cinema. But if you're looking purely at cinema content, and then TV content as well, what you find is that on the whole, the creatives within those industries, they do look to the subculture of ufology, and they find great creative inspiration from it within that. So things like the Men in Black, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, of the Fourth Kind, Area 51, all of these terms, Roswell, all these terms and ideas, they were part of the common language of ufology decades before Hollywood lifted them and popularized them and fictionalized them, essentially. But, all of these things have their root in our lived historical reality. And so that's something that I explore in the book. But yeah, certainly, and the example I use of how it's, in terms of the chicken and egg, the Avatar, James Cameron's Avatar movie is currently the most successful movie of all time. It's hugely successful. I think it's grossed in excess of $2.8 billion. So this is a film about giant blue extraterrestrials. Okay, it's been seen by, I would think, most people in the Western world and beyond, and people have seen images from it. And yet, what we didn't see following the release of Avatar was a huge influx of reports of 10-foot-tall blue aliens in ufology. Yeah. You didn't see any. Okay, it didn't happen because cinema does not directly incite UFO sightings, contrary to popular opinion, contrary to the skeptical opinion. People don't see a UFO movie and all of a sudden go out and start reporting UFOs. Now, there is, but again, I should clarify that. You can certainly get excited by a UFO movie, go outside and then see a twinkling star and then get excited about that and maybe report it as a UFO. So that can happen. But what it doesn't lead to is close encounters. There's no mistake. If you've gone outside and you've seen a giant spaceship above you, and then you have some kind of an encounter with some non-human entity, that's not something that's going to be conjured by a movie. That's some kind of extraordinary experience, assuming you're of sound mind and not on drugs, right? So, but these sightings are what define the UFO enigma, these encounters. I'm not really interested in lights in the sky. I'm interested in grassroots reports of things that really defy rational explanation. And these are typically close encounters, and close encounters of where the witness is within 500 feet of an object, of an unidentified flying object, and you can see an object, or you can see an object and occupants within its vicinity or inside, to anything up to apparent alien abductions and literal face-to-face encounters. Now, all of this stuff is very hard to accept, and it shouldn't be accepted, blindly at all. It should be rigorously researched and questioned. But what's left is this hardcore of cases where you have literally millions of rational intelligent people reporting things which simply should not be happening, and they have apparently no motivation to do this because they're not interested in financial gain. In fact, all they gain is ridicule.
You see, what I would say here about this subject, and particularly about your analysis, one of the reasons I'm such a fan of what you do, is, if you think of the process of, what would it be, hypnosis, any form of mental conditioning, where someone says something to you over and over again and conditions your mind to think in a particular way. So what would we think? Like a dog, you tell it to sit, you push its backside down and it sits, and you keep doing it long enough. In the end, it's kind of an instant reaction. It's a response they don't even need to think about. The idea goes that people in this country and the Western world have been conditioned deliberately to, whenever they think of UFOs, sneer, play some Twilight Zone music and go, this is nonsense, this isn't real. And what I'm often led to thinking about, and wonderfully, there is no strict conclusion to this question in your book, by the way, and I was looking for a conclusion to it, is that something that has happened accidentally as a result of this cultural dialogue that you're talking about? Is it accidental? Is it deliberate? Is it a bit of both? And how would we ever know the answer to that question? Obviously we can't, but we can surmise, can't we?
Yeah, it started off quite deliberately. The idea that UFOs should be debunked and demystified through media channels traces back to the CIA Robertson panel of 1953. And this was where leading scientists were convened to assess the UFO phenomenon, whether it posed a threat to national security, and what should be done about it. And they concluded that UFOs posed no direct threat to national security, but the belief in them, interest in the phenomenon, should be actively discouraged, and that UFOs should be debunked and demystified, that's their terms, through media and through entertainment media and through Disney as well, specifically was highlighted in the Robertson panel recommendations. This is now public. And so what you had was a quite aggressive campaign going through the 50s, 60s, 70s and potentially beyond, where all forms of media, news media, factual media, entertainment media, aggressively debunked and demystified UFOs, and they put this blanket of ridicule around the subject. And as you say, now it's just standard practice. But the point is, it's not so. So if you turn on the TV and you're watching BBC News and there's a little segment, and finally we're going to talk to some UFO guy or whatever about a new UFO movie or something like that. The format. What's going to happen is you're going to hear the X-Files music every time. Literally, it will just be every time the X-Files music, and then you'll have the news reporter wearing a trench coat, and you'll have it'll be shot at a funny angle with a light behind him or whatever, and he'll be like, it'll have Twilight Zone music. And that has now just become standard. That's not to suggest the people who are at the BBC making that are part of a conspiracy. That's not how it works. That's just ingrained now.
Yeah, can I come in here, Robbie? Can I come in here? Does it actually mean that the people who are working like that have been conditioned?
Yes. Yeah, and they've been conditioned by, they are, what they're doing is a product of seeds that were planted decades prior. And in the past, when people were following those, because at one point in the early 1950s, for example, there was a policy, it was an actual policy to debunk and demystify. Now, people at BBC now don't have that policy in front of them. They don't have a memo saying debunk and demystify. It's just part of the culture now to do so, because UFOs are not accepted by consensus reality. They are something that's fringe and something to be derided and something that's a little bit of fun. And so it goes without saying that you're going to put X-Files music in front of a UFO segment. But back in the day, back in the 1950s, UFOs were considered to be a national security concern very seriously. These back in the late 1940s, the CIA and Air Force were getting reports from their personnel of unidentified flying objects over nuclear installations in the United States, Los Alamos, and other facilities. Objects traveling up to 27,000 miles per hour, stopping, turning, doing impossible maneuvers. This is in their own documentation, declassified now. And what's revealed in that documentation is a very serious concern about a really mystifying phenomenon. And they didn't know what this represented. They speculated, and the Air Force actually concluded quietly in 1948 that it was probably interplanetary. These conclusions were discouraged and buried.
Hang on, can I stop you there? Sorry, this is new. That I didn't catch that. I didn't say that again. They actually decided it was interplanetary in 1948.
The Air Force, in its first UFO investigations project, which was called Project Sign, which was a precursor to Project Blue Book, the group of officers who were tasked to investigating UFOs at the time, they concluded in a report called an estimate of the situation, that UFOs, in all likelihood, were interplanetary in nature, true UFOs, the ones that were really baffling, because they couldn't come to any other logical explanation. They considered Soviets, they considered other earthly technologies and natural phenomena, but none of these seemed to account for what was being reported by their highly trained military personnel and by people around the world. And they concluded quietly that yes, the term that they used was interplanetary. Now, they made some copies of this. They sent it to the Air Force Chief of Staff, Hoyt Vandenberg, who was so alarmed by it that he ordered all copies burned, because he said this simply cannot be the official position of the Air Force. A couple of copies survived, however, and the head of Project Blue Book, the Air Force UFO Investigations Project, Captain Edward Ruppelt, he actually saw one of these reports and later wrote about it in his first book about UFOs in 1955, the report on unidentified flying objects. So he's a very serious, very well-respected individual, and he documents it in his book. So this was something that was concluded in the late 1940s, and that's not surprising given the nature of the reports that they were getting, given the nature of reports that we can now see in their own documentation. So if you've got objects that are traveling 27,000 miles an hour over nuclear facilities and doing what they want, and avoiding radar, and there's only so many conclusions you can draw, and this was the conclusion that they drew. That's not to say that it's correct, but it would seem to have some logic to it. So whatever they were, they didn't know. The fact is, they didn't know what they were dealing with, and when they didn't know what they tried to, they just thought, we don't want people asking questions about this subject. We don't want people taking it seriously. We want it to just be quiet. We can study it quietly, but we don't want anyone else interested in it. So we're just going to discourage interest, and that's what they did through media channels. They ridiculed it. So people didn't really dare to engage with it in a serious way after that, and that took effect throughout the following decades, and it happened very quickly. And then, of course, Hollywood's B movies about the subject, Hollywood's Earth versus the Flying Saucers and The Blob and all of these kind of films that were about alien invasion and visitation. They were these schlocky, cheap productions aimed at teens at the drive-in, and they, just through the nature of the movies themselves and their content and the way of engaging with the subject, they served to ridicule it also. Now, the question is, was that simply Hollywood cashing in on a genuine public hysteria and fascination with UFOs, or was it Hollywood being encouraged to make these films by Washington for political purposes, for in line with the Robertson panel recommendations? Again, there's no solid conclusion to be drawn. I do speculate to an extent in the book about that and provide some evidence going one way, but what we're looking at overall is a natural cultural process. So although in the early years, demonstrably, the CIA and the Air Force really were aggressively anti-UFO, and that they really used media. They used all forms of media to further their anti-UFO agenda. What was happening simultaneously was a natural cultural process where Hollywood recognized Hollywood is an industry, it's a business, and it's about making money, and they recognized that people were fascinated with this field, with this subject, with the idea of aliens. And so they were going to make movies, whether they were told to or not. They would make these movies. And, so let's just play devil's advocate and say there's never been any official involvement in a UFO movie. There has, but let's just say there hasn't. Yeah. And there's never been any encouragement to make a UFO movie. People would still make UFO movies, okay? People would still be making these movies about UFOs because they're going to sell, as Avatar proves. And films about alien visitation have proved consistently to be some of the most successful of all time over many decades. In fact, most of the most successful films of all time have something to do with aliens in them. So it's consistently fascinating for us. But the result is that because cinema is an innately fantastical medium and associated with forms of public fantasy, we associate whatever it depicts with fantasy on some level. right? Whatever it depicts becomes on some level fictionalized. But at the same time, it also actualizes its subject matter as well on a subconscious level. If there's a movie about it, it must be real in some way. But then paradoxically, if there's a movie about it, it can't be real because it's a movie. And this is something I refer to as hyperreality. This state, this inability of consciousness to distinguish between fact and fantasy, or an unwillingness to distinguish between fact and fantasy, and especially where things like UFOs are concerned, because UFOs don't officially exist, they are not part of our consensus reality, and therefore everything that we know about them, or what we think we know about them, for the most part, for most people, comes through forms of entertainment media. It comes through cinema, and that's problematic, of course, because most of cinema's depictions of UFOs are based in fact. They're based in something that's been historically reported, but it's been distorted then through Hollywoodization, and then the result is this kind of mishmash of fact and fantasy, and so I'm just throughout the book really just trying to sort this fact from fantasy and to see what truth, if any, underlies any of these movies.
So I wonder, I mean, it starts with something happening. It starts with a deliberate policy. But then again, I'm thinking in the modern era, I say modern, I'm showing my age here, Robbie, but the film I've got in my mind is Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And I'll be honest, that's one of those films that made me think, well, maybe there's something in it. I didn't condition me away from the topic. I mean, if we leave the hyper reality thing for a moment, that thought will come back to just towards the end of the piece, I think, because that speaks to me very deeply. But I wonder, Steven Spielberg. There we are. You've got the U.S. government briefing in the 50s. All right, cover this up, dismiss it. Steven Spielberg comes along. What do you think was going on there?
Well, that was an exceptional film, and an exception to the kind of it broke the trend of Hollywood's engagement with UFOs. So, as I say, throughout the 50s, 60s, there really wasn't many UFO movies in the 70s at all. There was a lull in the subgenre during that period, but in the 50s and 60s, and especially in the 50s, there was a huge influx of UFO movies, but all of them were schlocky B movies. For the most, there were a very small handful of serious quality productions. Yeah. You can list them on one hand, but then by 1977, when Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out, people didn't really know how to engage with it anymore in a creative way, because it was seen as something that was for teens at the drive-in. Spielberg broke that trend, and he said that he wanted to engage with this in a very serious way, and that his film would not be science fiction but science speculation, and it was based on his in-depth knowledge and research of UFOs, which he'd been obsessed with the subject since he was a teenager, and he enlisted J.L. Hynek, the famed astronomer and ufologist, to be his technical assistant on the movie, to advise on the movie, and he has a cameo in the movie. And so this is a film that was really based on reported UFO sightings, on UFO theory, on UFO literature and debate. And there's almost every scene in the film is based on something that has been reported. And so this concerned the Air Force and NASA, because Spielberg actually approached both of these agencies for their support on the film, and the Air Force declined to cooperate because they said explicitly, our policy is not to cooperate on UFO movies, and therefore we will not contravene that. The NASA went even further, according to Spielberg, and NASA wrote him a 20-page letter requesting that he not make the film at all, because they were worried that it would spark a huge interest in UFOs, and that they would be inundated with reports of UFOs and aliens, and they didn't want to deal with that. So they asked him not to make the film. So this convinced Spielberg that there must be something to the phenomenon if it got these agencies so upset. So this was an unusual film, and by all accounts, it shouldn't have really been successful. And it was hugely successful. Close Encounters, I should say, is my favourite film of all time, and it's just a masterpiece of a movie. But at the same time, it's a mess. Like, on a narrative level, it's a complete mess of a movie. It's just complete mishmash. Oh well, there's so many plot holes There's so many things that Spielberg sets up and doesn't resolve. A lot of stuff that doesn't make sense. It's a very flabby movie as well, but none of this makes any difference at all. But had you given that screenplay, I'm talking about on a script level here. Yeah. If you gave Spielberg's screenplay to another director, it would have been a poor movie. It would have been a very confusing movie and forgettable movie. Spielberg, the genius of that film lies in Spielberg's direction and his passion and enthusiasm for the subject. He just infuses every frame. This is just straight from Spielberg's soul, and this is like the result of all of his childhood and teenage obsession, and it's just bursting out of him on screen. And so the whole thing is just propelled by Spielberg's passion, and that's his genius as a director. Now, it's not a bad screenplay, but it's kind of messy. And in today's Hollywood system, it would be tweaked heavily, and it would be much more refined. It would lose its brilliance for that. Its brilliance lies in its imperfection. But this was a film that, as I say, it shouldn't have been successful because, again, even the title of the movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, no one had even heard of that term. Most people don't even know what it means today. They would associate the idea of close encounter with a UFO now, but only because of that film. But Spielberg was insistent that he use this heavily ufological term as the title of his movie, and the studios were not in favour of this at all. They said, we don't want to call it Close Encounters of the Third Kind. No one knows what the hell that means.
Well, hang on, define it for us. Tell us for anyone listening that doesn't.
So Close Encounter of the Third Kind is a sighting of a UFO, an unidentified flying object, within 500 feet of the witness, during which UFO occupants' entities are also seen. So they can be seen within the vicinity of the craft, in the craft itself, but all within 500 feet. And that was the definition of Jal and Hynek, again, who was in the movie and advising on the movie. That's the Close Encounter of the Third Kind. Actually, it's actually not true to the movie, because what they have in the movie is a close encounter of the fourth kind, because people are abducted in the movie, but that term didn't exist at the time. Close encounter of the fourth kind is what we understand today as a typical alien abduction, and the close encounter of the fifth kind is a more mutual meeting between humans and aliens, typically more benevolent than the rather scary fourth kind. But there's only three kinds at that point. So Spielberg wanted it to be, this was Spielberg's exploration of ufology, and so Spielberg's an interesting director. Because
let me sorry to interrupt. Let me just come in here though. I want to highlight something. I don't want you to lose the thought. You were just saying Spielberg's an interesting director, but if I just come in here, what I think is really interesting about what you're saying, and I want to highlight it for people listening. In the 70s, they kind of ran out of ideas. And then this guy comes along, Steven Spielberg, and it's not that he's been inspired, it's that he's researched a story. In other words,
precisely.
The inspiration, and you highlight this in the book, and it's one of those things that always annoys me. Aliens are not often very alien. They seem to be pretty human. They've often got, the classic grey, 4 foot tall, accounts vary, 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, a mouth. They're not they're humanoid, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this is the interesting thing about it, is that if we're talking about works of fantasy here, why aren't the finest creative minds in the world coming up with things that just don't, that are alien, that are more alien than us?
Right, exactly. Well, so the answer to that is that Hollywood, as I say, to repeat myself, Hollywood draws its inspiration primarily in these movies from fact-based literature and debate. It draws its inspiration from ufology. And if you look at ufology, if you look at the grassroots reports of UFOs from around the world across the decades, people don't report three-headed monsters. They don't report tentacled blobs. They report humanoid entities. They report beings typically short in stature, sometimes our own height, slightly taller sometimes, and they, although they differ in their fine features, they are humanoid. And but again, on an evolutionary level, if we are dealing with extraterrestrials, that shouldn't come as a surprise, because
it does to me. It does to me. Why not?
Well, not if they're getting here in structured craft, right? If they're getting here in structured in spacecraft, if the UFOs that people are seeing are their craft. Now, I'm not saying this is the case. I mean, I honestly don't know what to think when it comes to the true underlying nature of the UFO phenomenon. Yeah. But I think some credence has to be given to the idea of extraterrestrial visitation. Given what we know about the universe, given what we know about the size and age of the universe, it makes sense that life will have evolved to advanced levels throughout our galaxy and beyond. And if it's evolved sufficiently, and which it certainly can have, given the age of the universe, 13-odd billion years, then we could be seeing, then there conceivably could be beings out there millions or even billions of years more advanced than we are. But if they are to be a technological species, okay, then they need appendages. They need to have some kind of a resemblance to us, or us to them, as may be the case. If they're going to be flying a spaceship, they need opposable thumbs, presumably, to be able to build things and hold things. And so this is, you're not going to have a blob flying in a flying saucer. Okay, a blob is going to be probably staying where it is. It might be intelligent, it might be highly intelligent, but because it doesn't have the means to create things, it's probably just going to sit and think.
Yeah, right? I see. I wonder, I guess, is it that we're talking perhaps here about, they call it parallel evolution? I read about it in a Dawkins book, where you have things that have evolved independently of each other, but they have evolved a similar system to, deal with their environment. Yeah.
And you do have, I mean, different like reports of UFO entities do differ, and there are some exotic examples, but not hugely. Almost everything that's reported is humanoid. Yeah. Some robotic beings have been reported, which again is actually the current thinking of mainstream science. People suggest that if there is life out there, a lot of the life out there in the universe now would probably be artificially intelligent. It would be machine life, essentially, because again, given the age of the universe and the inevitability of the creation of artificial intelligence by any biological civilization, the AI will eventually supersede I guess it will be a Terminator 2 Judgment Day scenario, and that's it will eventually kind of, I mean, it might even be more. Who knows? I mean, it's the idea is that life is teeming with artificial intelligence, and that may be the case. But most of what people seem to report seems to be biological in nature. But people even ask the question about why these craft are all flying saucer shaped and disc shaped. Well, that's kind of a misconception. A lot of them are, but a lot of them aren't. Some are triangular, some are rectangular, some are spherical, some are cylindrical. In fact, almost every shape you can imagine has been reported. And indeed, a lot of the encounters that people report, especially the fourth kind, these kind of weird abduction experiences, people don't actually report seeing a UFO at all. Some of these experiences are very, they're kind of, they're intangible in a way. They are almost psychic. And again, so that's why they're very easy to dismiss, but it's hugely problematic. I don't really draw any conclusions about the nature of the UFO phenomenon itself in the book, because I think that to do so is just hugely presumptuous, because we just don't know enough about it. Even the people, and I've interviewed a lot of people who've had extreme experiences with UFOs and apparent non-human entities, and even those people who've had a lifetime of these experiences, who I do believe they've had strange experiences. They're certainly not lying. They don't appear to be lying, and they've certainly, to my knowledge, gained nothing from their stories. Yeah. These people have these experiences, but they themselves don't understand what they're dealing with. They don't, but they are inclined to kind of squash their experiences into this box that's neatly labelled extraterrestrials, and I think that to an extent, Hollywood's depictions of these phenomena do shape their own understanding of a genuinely anomalous experience that they have had. So people have strange experiences, and there may well be some extraterrestrial component to them, or it may be something much more profound and personal, or kind of it must be maybe more earthly. Who knows? But UFO movies, I think, do to an extent shape our expectations of how this phenomenon should manifest. And so that's, I think that is something that needs to be examined as well. But most people in the UFO community don't actually engage with Hollywood. They talk about it in a kind of a passing way, and they speculate about Hollywood UFO conspiracies, but they don't really take time to engage with the true cultural, the cultural effect of Hollywood, because it's something. I've studied it for years now, and I've still struggled to get my head around it.
Well, I wonder if we have a little look at some of this stuff here. And by the way, for people who are looking to get hold of this book, it's an awesome piece of work. Silver Screen Saucers: Sorting Fact from Fantasy in Hollywood's UFO Movies. And let's return to Steven Spielberg, who's, like you say, an interesting director. I mean, you've looked into the substance behind these fictional stories and, say, Close Encounters. You've researched all of these different stories. Is there any one or two stories that really stick in your mind that you think there's something in that, there really is something in that, and you're not going to go and say, obviously, it's an extraterrestrial, but there must be a few that have really just stuck with you whilst you've been researching this?
You mean in terms of sort of separate from the movies and just actual
real life experiences? Yeah, when you've gone off, you've gone, right, okay, so that's based on this case here or that case there. You've gone off, you've spoken to these people, or you've looked into it, and you've come away and you've just thought, because I picture you as a non-believer, Robbie Graham. I picture you as a non-believer who, like me, has encountered things that they simply can't explain, and people who are not behaving as they would do if they were making it up. Am I wrong?
Yeah, no, I am by nature. I think I'm like, if people who know me very well describe myself as a skeptic, they would think that's not true at all. I am fundamentally a skeptic. I question in the sense that I question everything to its core, and but at the same time, I'm a skeptic who has a very open mind, and I really see no limits to this universe and to the things that are possible within it. But at the same time, just because they're possible doesn't mean that they happen, and that they happen whenever people say that they happen. So I am a skeptic, but I go into things with the expectation that something is probably not so, but that it could be so. And I took, my interest in this goes back, and this is an answer to your question, Nick, but I think I need to just say, so my interest in this goes back to my childhood really, and then intensified in my teens in a big way. And I read all the literature, like I read dozens and dozens and dozens of UFO books, and watched documentaries and stuff, and I was fascinated by it, and it had natural appeal for me. But at the same time, I never really believed it. I never fully believed it, or rather, I never accepted it. To quote the X-Files, I wanted to believe, but never quite did. Or there's a difference between belief and acceptance, I'd say. And so I probably believed, but I didn't accept.
Oh, this is deep. Explain the distinction between belief and acceptance.
Well, I didn't know it myself until it actually happened. And so all these years when I was reading books about UFOs, I guess I wouldn't read them all unless I had some kind of underlying belief. But then none of it seemed, because I thought, I'm reading about all this stuff, these people having these experiences all around the world. There seems to be some whole nother layer of reality that none of us are, that in our everyday reality is just completely inaccessible to us, and it may as well be in a TV show or a movie. And I just thought, so how can it be? How can I be going to school or college and doing all of this mundane stuff while someone else somewhere in Brazil or something is having some close encounter with some species of aliens from some other quadrant in the galaxy, and then meanwhile various branches of the government have got like secret alien craft, and there's, how can they be, what's going on at Area 51? I used to think, what the hell's going on at Area 51 right now? Like, if I'm here walking through the woods, what's happening now in Nevada at Area 51? I used to think about this all the time, right? But I thought, so this can't be, because I can't see it or access it, and because I'm here in my little village in England, can it really be happening? Can any of this stuff be happening if I haven't experienced it, right? And I realise that's a very insular and self-absorbed way of thinking, but that's how most people think, I think, especially as a teenager. And and then I kind of took a break from the subject because my film studies and stuff got in the way when I went to university and all that kind of stuff. And that became my obsession. And then a couple of years later, I was just like, again, I was taking a walk. I used to take a lot of long. I wish I had the time now, but I don't. I used to take a lot of long walks through the woods, Cannock Chase, in fact, which is one of the UFO hotspots of the UK, which is like literally on my doorstep where I grew up. And I'd go walking on my own and ponder the universe stuff. And then, I don't know, my mind returned to the UFO subject, and I started to read, because I started to read a few more books on the subject and stuff. And I just thought, how do I, with a slightly more mature mind now, a couple of years later, I was in my 20s by this point, early 20s. How do I reassess this? How do I engage with this? Is this worth my time still? Like what? And just a slow, and by this point I'd already interviewed a whole bunch of witnesses and experiences and stuff. And I just thought, how do I make sense of this person's experience? And how do I make sense of all of the reams and reams of documentation on this subject and officially declassified materials, and the fact that demonstrably almost every government on earth has had an active interest in the subject going back decades. So do the governments have secret files on the Loch Ness Monster? And probably not, or fairies, probably not, but they do on UFOs. And that raises some questions. And I thought, so what? And then my belief, which had been dormant for a while, kind of just came to be an acceptance that right there and then in this walk that I was taking. And I thought, oh shit, yeah, this is probably real. This is like, there's probably something really fundamentally profound underlying this, possibly alien, whatever that alien means, non-human, and that this reality that I'm experiencing now is very limited. And I thought, shit, yeah. It kind of was a depressing thought because it was scary.
Do you know what? This is so interesting to hear someone speaking like this, Robbie, and I'm glad I asked you the question, and we'll get to it in a second, some of the cases that may have drawn you to this point. But similar experience for me, I never really took it seriously. I was always interested in it, but I never thought it was real. I didn't think it was, actually happening. I just thought people were saying it was, and I didn't know what it was, and I was interested in it. So you look into it, and then there's the moment, I spoke to Edgar Mitchell, sixth man on the moon. He drops the bombshell on me that, yeah, it's real, governments are covering it up, what? Right? And then, he pretty much was like that about it. And I'm like, this guy is a serious figure, a serious political figure. He's been on the moon, and here he is on a national radio station telling me this stuff is real. And I had a similar experience to how you describe it. I accepted there was something in it. That's all. That's all I got to.
Yeah, but then you have to. But then you, and that's all that most people get to. That's all that most people get to, or either consciously or they'll be fine and they'll say there's something to it. But then most people don't go a little bit further and say, well, let's pursue that. If there's something in it, what is it, and how far does it go? And my mind just wouldn't stop. But the nature of the phenomenon, it seems to be almost deliberately elusive and enigmatic and covert, and it doesn't seem to exhibit any interest in revealing itself to us in a spectacular way that's acceptable to all. It seems to flit in and out of our perception on an individual level, and it profoundly affects individual lives, and then sometimes kind of really screws up those lives, and sometimes it makes those lives better and more profound and whatever, but sometimes it really affects them. So that actually, I guess, leads me to one of the experiences which really for me has stayed with me to this day. And this is not an experience, this is not a UFO experience that I've had, it's something that someone else has had, but their telling of it has just stayed with me forever. And there's a number of these, but this was a guy. It's so crazy. When I was a teenager, there was a newsletter, like a monthly newsletter, like this is before the internet was even big. That would come that you could buy and have delivered or whatever. And I think I bought it at a UFO group or something like that. And And I was flicking through this thing, and I read an encounter in there, a report of an encounter on Cannock Chase, which is, as I say, which is where I live, where I used to live, rather. And this huge woodland of like 90 square miles of woodland, forever been a hotspot for UFOs and paranormal activity and all that kind of stuff. And in this report described an encounter from about 1995, it said, and the details are sketchy, but it involved a man who had gone for a walk in the woods in early August in the mid-90s with his dog, and as he often did later, sort of like just as the sun was going down. And this guy he came to a clearing in the trees. This was around 9:30 at night, so it was almost dark, but there was still a bit of light left. Just after 9, and all of a sudden he came into his clearing in the trees, and he saw a pool of mist just above the floor in a kind of a very neat circle, about 30 feet in diameter. This pool of mist, and then as he got closer, he could see that within the mist was an object. And the mist kind of cleared, and he could see this basically a disc-shaped object on the floor, or just above it. And he thought, huh. And then all of a sudden, he heard the bushes behind him rustling, and the bushes to the side of him, and 3 guys came out of the bushes, and then they stood near him. And he said that at this point he was thinking the idea that, like, he was not a believer at all in UFOs. The alien, the science fiction, stuff like that was just of no interest to him whatsoever. He was a kind of a salt of the earth kind of guy. And he saw these guys, and they stood in front of him. They were about 5'6" in height, completely human looking, slightly olivey, like Italian features, skin tone, sandy hair, and both of the men. I said there was 2. There was 2 men rather, not 3. Right. Were identical to one another, and he thought that was a bit odd. But again, he's just thinking he's a human. These are human guys, and the object in front of that he's seeing, this disc-shaped object, must be a test craft. It's a military craft that's come down in the woods, and they're having some technical difficulty. And these guys are stood there in their overalls, and one of them's holding a box, and one of them's holding a rod of some kind, metal rod. And they say to him, well, one of them says to him, "What are you doing here? Like, why are you here?" And he says, "I'm just taking my dog for a walk." And they say, "Do you do this often?" And he's like, "Often as I can, but I'd like to do it more. I'd like to keep fit." And he's a little bit perplexed by the situation. And then these guys say, they ask him a few more things. Ask him, I can't even remember the questions. I've got this written down somewhere. They ask him a few more kind of innocuous questions, and then they say, "Would you like to take a ride in our craft?" And he says, and then all of a sudden he says he felt panicked, like he would have got the feeling that he was never going to see his wife again. Right. And he said, no, thank you. And they said, okay. And then at that point, one of the guys raised his arm, raised the rod that was in his hand, and the end of the rod turned red. And then that was the last he remembered. He blacked out and woke up in his car, back in the car park several miles away, with his dog. And this was the next morning, with no memory of how he'd got there. And he got home to his wife, and she was like, "Where have you been?" And so that was all I knew of this story, because I'd read this in this report. Well, actually, I hadn't read it in that much detail, to be honest. I later found out this from the man himself, because then. So then several years later, I was at a meeting in the Staffordshire UFO group where Nick Redfern used to go a lot. And so I kind of met Nick there, and would go and see other people there. And Nick Redfern was actually giving a talk that night about the FBI files and dusty old files and stuff like that. And there was a big turnout. And I was waiting in the kind of the lobby area, and before the talk started, and I saw this guy walk in, and I didn't recognize him, and he seemed really out of place. He seemed really uncomfortable, and he was in his 60s, and this was now about 2001, 2002, and this guy walks in, and he immediately gravitates towards me, probably because he sees me looking at him, and he says hi, and I'm like hi, and he says like, what are you here for and stuff. I'm like, I'm here to watch this lecture by Nick Redfern, and going to be talking about FBI. It's going to be brilliant and all this kind of stuff. And he's like, all right. And then he just looked really deeply uncomfortable, shuffling around and looking at everyone, and really doesn't look like he wants to be there at all. And then I said, he asked me, have I seen anything? Have I seen a UFO? And I said, not really, nothing, definitive. And I said, have you seen a UFO? And he said, no. And he goes, well, yeah, I saw something years ago, like in the woods or something, and that was it. And I said, like, right, okay. And he was like, you had to see him shuffling on the spot, and you can almost feel the discomfort of this guy. And it was like he wanted me to ask him more questions. He was kind of trying to gauge whether or not I would think he was totally insane. Yeah. And I said, nothing you can tell me will surprise me, basically. I've read enough. And he was like, well, anyway, I saw some kind of object, in the woods and kind of chase years ago. And I thought, and all of a sudden my mind started ticking. I thought, this is ringing a bell. And lots of people have seen things on Canic Chase, but all of a sudden I started to think about that report that I'd read years ago. And this guy, by the way, I should say, didn't know that his story had been reported at all. He didn't know that it had been published. He didn't know that I knew about it or that anyone knew about it. Mm-hmm. He had told it to an investigator called Tony Dodd, who's now dead. And Tony Dodd, without this guy's permission, published that report in his newsletter. And the guy never read it. So this guy was telling me a story which I already knew part of, but which he didn't know that had ever been published. And he'd never been part of the UFO community at all. So by weird chance, he'd kind of come in that day. I was there. And he came over to me, probably the only person there who'd read his story. and then I started to recognise that this might be the guy. And then gradually, over about half an hour, this story emerged. And every point he'd be saying, "Oh, I'm not mad. I'm not crazy or anything. I'm not. I know, it seemed crazy." He's a really rough kind of guy. The last person that you would ever expect to see it. I mean, there are certain types of people who frequent UFO groups. This is not the kind of guy that you see at UFO groups. And he was genuinely in search of answers. He was here to try and find an answer to something that has been kind of plaguing him for years. And he told me anyway that he saw this object. And I said, "Did you see anything else?" And he said, No, I didn't. Well, he said, there were people. I won't go into it. This could go on a while, but you get the idea. Eventually, this story came out, and it came out in much more detail than I've just told you, and in more detail that I'd known previously. And what I then found out from him was that when he got home that night, or that morning rather, he and his wife were having marital trouble. They'd been having marital trouble for quite some time, and they were on the rocks basically. And when he got back that morning, with no excuse as to where he'd been, his wife assumed that he'd been with another woman. And he said, "Well, no, I haven't. I've been speaking to spacemen." Yeah. Or what? He didn't use the terms because he didn't even use those terms to me. I think he just told her what he'd experienced. And she obviously didn't believe him. He didn't once use the word UFO, alien, anything like that to me at all. He was in disbelief, blatant disbelief at his own experience. Like the idea, like the very notion that he could have had an experience even resembling this was of deep trouble to him. Like he was deeply troubling. He was you could see that it actually ruined his life. And as a result of coming home that morning, that was kind of that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, and he and his wife separated eventually a few months later. And ever since, he's been just trying to figure out what the hell happened. And this was the first UFO meeting he ever turned up to. But what I found out was that some of the details of the report were wrong, as reported in the magazine. It wasn't actually the 1990s. It was actually 1988. He was very specific. He said it was August 4th, 1988. This for me was like, oh my God, because August 4th, 1988 was the date on Cannock Chase of another close encounter with a UFO by a local couple in my village. And this was actually the encounter which first introduced me to UFOs at age 7. When I was at primary school, a friend of mine, Matthew Morgan, he came into school and he said, the UFO landed on our car last night. And everyone's like, oh, wow, UFOs landed on his car. No one really believed it, but kind of like, wow, UFOs landed on his car. And then it turned out that was actually in the paper at the time, and his parents reported it. And it didn't actually land on the car, but they had some kind of a close encounter with a UFO. And this is just a stone's throw, literally, from where I lived. And again, on the very edge of Cannock Chase. And do interrupt if I'm going on too long here.
No, I'm enjoying this. I'm really enjoying it. I think it's really interesting as well how synchronicity and all those kind of things even play a part in your life. And I wouldn't have expected that, Robbie. But go on.
Well, So this is 1988. I was 7 years old, and I went home thinking, "Wow, UFOs landed on a car nearby," and all this kind of stuff. But you forget about it, and then it wasn't until years later, when I was in my late teens and I was actively investigating UFOs, that I came back to this case, and I realised that it was actually a case. I went and interviewed this kid's parents, who are now in their 60s, and I sat with them and I recorded the interview and I made notes and all that kind of stuff. And they were very obviously being truthful. They were still completely baffled by it today. They never sought any fame or money from it at all. The local paper reported on it. They never received any money or anything like that. They got a huge amount of ridicule locally for it. But what happened with them on the same day as this other guy reported his close encounter with these beings was that these people, the Morgans, were driving home from a charity meeting. It was about midnight on August 4th, 1988, and they were turning onto a little bridge called the Wheatman's Bridge in Little Haywood, which is the village where I grew up. And if you look out my brother's window from our family house, you can basically see the bridge. It's that close. And they were turning onto this bridge, and as they were doing so, this object was just there. It was hanging over the bridge, half over the bridge, half over the river, about the size of a double-decker bus. They described it, glowing, something straight out of a Steven Spielberg movie. They didn't use those terms, but it sounds like something exactly like that. Glowing object, disc-shaped, a bank of lights on it, absolutely silent, and before they even saw the object, they sensed it, in the sense that they were talking in the middle of a conversation, everything went deadly quiet, like they couldn't hear the engine anymore. Everything was just deadly quiet. And this is the Oz factor that people report when they see UFOs. Everything just has an otherworldly sense to it. They seem to be out of their normal sense of reality. And all of a sudden they turn and they look and they see this thing over the bridge, and he thinks he's going to crash into it. And all of a sudden this thing lifts up just silently and just goes and shoots off like in a literal blink of an eye. It goes across the river and just vanishes into over the next village, gone. And then he turns over the bridge and then pulls over to the side of the road to stop and gain his composure, because they're so shocked. And they're like, "What the bloody hell was that?" They go home and ring the police, because they don't know who else to ring. Mm-hmm. and then the police through the police, the press got hold of it. And then the press came to report on it. Now, what happened was, again, this wasn't known to me until all these years later when I started researching it properly, was that the Ministry of Defence, our UK Ministry of Defence, actually had 8 files on that case. They sent investigators out, and they actually investigated that case, but they never interviewed the witnesses. So they sent out their own people from DI-55 the defense intelligence staff, who officially were never involved in UFOs at all, because Nick Pope was supposed to be the guy who was in charge of all UFO investigations, but of course he was essentially just a front for deeper investigations by DI-55 and DSTI and the broader defense intelligence staff. And so
hang on, DSTI, these sound like diseases, man. Can you explain some of those acronyms just quickly?
So DI just means defense intelligence, and 55 is one of the compartments of one of the branches basically of defence intelligence in the UK, who have had a long-standing interest in UFOs. DSTI is Defence Intelligence Science and Technical Investigations,
right?
Intelligence, excuse me. And so those were so basically the UK government had an interest in this sighting, but not only this sighting, because this sighting, it turned out, was just one of literally dozens and dozens that were taking place all across Staffordshire, the Staffordshire region, at that time in 1988. And the summer of 1988 was a huge wave of UFO sightings across the whole area, and many people reporting they were in the papers and all this kind of stuff. And their sighting was just one, and then the other guy's sighting. So that happened August 4th, 1988. This bridge encounter, and then it was through this other guy who I met, who was telling me with bafflement about his own close encounter with human-looking beings. He told me that happened August 4th, 1988, and I just thought, oh my God, like that's crazy. And then I found more officially declassified DOD documents, MOD documents, Ministry of Defence documents, showing, documenting all of the other sightings that were reported to authorities over that summer. And there was yet another one in the same area, it would have been about a 30-minute drive from where these people had their encounter, and the object they described sounds almost exactly the same. So I'm thinking, is this, like, did these people crash into the same craft that this guy saw? Because he would have been within his encounter would have been literally within about 4 miles of where they were on the same night. And I just think this is just, and these people have never met, never heard each other's stories, and for all that kind of stuff, it just, you can. A lot of people would just go, oh well, you can't really make anything of it. Let's just forget about it. But you have to make something of it. You can't just forget about it. Yeah. People are having these experiences. You can't just say, well, I don't know. Let's see what's on the X Factor. Yeah. People are having impossible experiences that are really affecting their lives.
Do you know what? I couldn't agree more with what you're saying here. I know that I've taken you over the time that we agreed, so I know you're short of time. You're a busy guy, top author with all that kind of stuff, and also new father, as I understand it. So I know you're a busy chap. But it's funny how we're on such similar pages with it, because, yeah, like you say, how can people ignore this story if it breaks? If it happens, if the disclosure moment comes, the journalist that does that is surely going to, Pulitzer Prize, you'd win every single prize in the world, surely. It's the biggest story around, and yet so many journalists don't pursue any of these angles at all. That blows me away.
Yeah, it does. But I don't think, and as I say in the book, I don't really buy into the disclosure myth anymore. It's appealing, it's intoxicating, but it is just that. It's a myth. It's a fantasy. It's based on a lot of assumptions about the nature of government and the nature of official power structures, but also about the nature of the phenomenon itself. And anyone who's really done research on this subject at a grassroots level, and anyone who's got some understanding of how power structures actually work and why they work the way they do, will see that the idea of a large-scale official disclosure event is fantasy. It's the stuff of Hollywood, and it can't happen. And if anything like that does happen, we should be very suspicious, because it won't be the truth. It will be their truth. It will be the truth that least vilifies and incriminates the secret keepers, and it will be a political truth. It will be a skewed truth, and it should be discarded automatically, because the people who have kept this stuff secret for so many decades are fundamentally deceptive. It's their job to be deceptive. They deal in deception. And they're, I'm talking about intelligence agencies here, and they're not suddenly going to change their spots overnight and become fundamentally open and transparent. They will continue to deceive, because that's what they do. They're not going to say, screw it, we've had enough of this secrecy now. Let's just reveal everything. But the point is that what do they actually have to reveal?
Yeah.
It's only their understanding of a phenomenon which surely defies their ultimate understanding as well. I don't care how much money and research and time they put into this. They can't possibly know the full, the underlying truth behind this enigma, because it's so multifaceted and it's so profound, and it's just, the idea that it's all just greys from the Zeta Reticuli system coming in, hybridizing themselves with us towards some kind of a colonization thing is something that's something that's been encouraged by Hollywood, but it's been encouraged by the intelligence community itself through Hollywood. We're probably not going to get a chance to talk about that now, but I do talk about that in the book. But there's so many different aspects to this phenomenon that are reported at a grassroots level, and that's what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in what any official power structure wants to tell me about this subject, because they can't tell me anything I can believe, because they are not to be believed. They're liars. Do
you know what? Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. And I've had experience in other areas with those kinds of organisations, and of course it's definitely the case. And I suppose what we're saying here, and I would agree with you on this if this is the case, is that what's going to happen? Well, probably long term, what's going to happen is some people are going to grow up, and I kind of feel like I've grown up on the issue, and we're going to snap out of the quite childish mindset that we've been conditioned to have deliberately at first, and then maybe by a combination of cock-up and conspiracy subsequently. We're going to undo that, and then we won't be relying on the media in the future. We'll be looking on the internet, and some of us will have accepted there's a phenomena worth looking into here, and then the real work begins, I think.
Well, that's already begun. That process that you've described, I agree. That's how it's going to go, and that's how it already is going. That's the way of it.
Yeah.
And it's this constant it's folk culture versus official culture, and what we're having here in this conversation on this radio show is firmly part of folk culture, you would never have this conversation in an official culture format on BBC radio, for example. Okay, not to this extent.
You wouldn't be allowed. You're not allowed.
Well,
this is the thing. You're not allowed.
No, you wouldn't, but it wouldn't be part of a conspiracy. And again, this is where people think that it's not part of a conspiracy. It's just because that's the culture, and that's because that's how it's become ingrained. And that's not to say. I mean, in the early years, there would have literally been a direct bar on it, but now it's just that these kind of avenues of inquiry are not deemed to be credible or acceptable in our official culture, and so we constantly have discussions like this in folk culture, and yes, they do eventually inform official culture, I suppose, to some extent through pop culture. But yeah, you do have this constant dichotomy, this paradox where simultaneously UFOs, for example, among many other things, are real to us or to many people, to people like us, but then they are unreal to everyone else, or to most other people. But then at the same time, opinion polls show that a great many people, like at least 50% of the population, actually believe in the existence of extraterrestrial life, and anywhere around 40 to 50 or 40 to 60, depending on what poll and what decade you're looking at, have believed in the idea of UFO visitation. And that's despite all of the aggressive debunkery through official culture. So you do have this underground current constantly exploring these ideas and valuing them, but then you've constantly got to fight against this backlash. So, but it's a slow process, and I think what it is that the people who are currently in positions of power and authority, who actually shape official culture, eventually, they don't change their minds, they don't change their spots. They just die. Eventually, they just die. as we all do. And then the next generation, who has slightly more progressive ideas and who's been exposed to exposed to different ideas, they then take up power. And then again, they're still representing official culture, and they're still gatekeepers. But then eventually they die, and it's just a slow process over generations. And this is the nature of UFO disclosure. People think about UFO disclosure as a one-time event where everything changes overnight and all the truth is revealed. It's something that takes generations.
Do you know what? I want to thank you for coming on the show. As always, an enriching conversation and plenty of stuff to think about. Listen, Robbie, how do people find your work? I want them to become fans. I want them to read this book. How do they go about finding you online? We'll put links across to you as well.
My book is available on Amazon, US, UK, Europe, Barnes & Noble. Any major bookseller has it online. It's called Silver Screen Sources. You can also find more information about the book and my work, my articles, and other things related to the book on my website, which is silverscreensources.uk. And so thanks very much for chatting with me today. I've enjoyed it. No worries, man. No worries. Listen, silverscreensources.uk. Go there, find out more about this chap, and thanks for a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much for that. Thanks, Nick.
So there we are, The Cult of Nick, another podcast. 2 weeks in a row now. We did one last week, we've done one this week. That's right, I'm going to try and get it back to a weekly fixture. It's dropped off the radar a little bit, hasn't it, The Cult of Nick? Because, I've been doing this thing. I've been doing this Talk to Me radio thing. And it's been really good fun. It's been really interesting. It's been really strange. It's been an enormous amount of work. And it seems to be that I don't have even the slightest slice of time to do anything ever. So, the number of people who have put in a call to me, like friends of mine, you've not talked to me for ages. Well, have we fallen out? No, not fallen out. I've not fallen out with anyone as far as I'm aware. That's the job of John Gaunt, the guy I'm producing. He falls out with everyone. I jest, of course, but no, I haven't fallen out with anyone or anything like that, and I certainly haven't turned my back on this podcast. I've just been super busy. It's all I've been doing. Listen, I've been setting up a radio station, and all that entails, including sorting out weird things like the bins, the phone lines to the office, that kind of stuff. It's a start-up. We're trying to get it off the ground, and we're working every hour God sends to get something happening that I've been talking about for absolutely donkey's years. In fact, most people in the radio industry have been pursuing what we're doing idly over a beer ever since I got involved in the radio industry. Wouldn't it be great if we could do it without any regulations? Well, that's possible now. It's possible, so that's what I've been doing. And, it's taken up an enormous amount of time. I've shifted the podcast to Acast. Right, here's the important thing. First of all, if you or any of your friends have had difficulty getting hold of this podcast, please communicate that to me as a matter of urgency. All right, we've shifted across, and audience figures wise, our audience figures are not as healthy as they have been because I've been neglecting the podcast. I spotted this weird thing about this podcast, right? I always say at the end, don't I? See you next Tuesday. And that's because I used to always put it out on a Tuesday. And what I noticed is that if I missed the Tuesday and maybe put it out on a Thursday, I'd lose a couple of hundred listeners. Always confused me, that, and I mentioned it in the past on the podcast. I think it must be something to do with people's routines and that kind of business. You always lose a couple hundred listeners if you were late with the podcast. Anyway, this podcast has been disastrously late for about 2 months. All right, it's been sporadically ejected, what would sporadically eject something? I don't know. It's been sporadically ejected anyway, something that sporadically ejects something. And as a result, we've lost about half our audience. So So that's fine. It might be to do with the fact that we've moved podcast provider, and so some people need to resubscribe, that kind of thing. But I guess we're going to go on a recruitment drive. Now, we've not done this for a bit, but I like the audience of this show to hover around, above the 5,500 point would be pretty good, I think. And at the moment, we got about 2,500 listeners, somewhere around there, 2,000 to 2,500 listeners. So what I want to do is double the audience. Nick, that's insane. How are you managing to do that? I'll tell you. Recommend us to 5 people. All right? Recommend the Cult of Nick to 5 different people, and tell them to do the same if you would. Let's get it spreading out like a virus and see how we can do. My intent is to double the audience in between now and next week. And I tell you what, Robbie Graham's interview, if you're not up for sharing that amongst people and showing them his great work, I don't know what's wrong with you. What a great interview that was. I mean, this idea of conditioning that he's talking about, that is pretty much bang on the money, don't you think? The conditioned do the conditioning because they've been conditioned to do the conditioning. Does that make any sense? It makes a lot of sense to me. Often I would have conspiracy theorists haranguing me, saying, oh, why didn't you say this? Why didn't you do that? Etc, etc, etc. And they'd say, you're doing that. They had this narrative in their head that I wouldn't explore a particular angle on Kerrang Radio or LBC or whatever it is, because I wasn't allowed to. And the Illuminati had told me what I had to talk about that particular day. No, not so. But sometimes I would not explore stories because I'd been successfully conditioned not to explore those stories. Are you following this? In other words, not deliberately, but people have certain points of view, don't they? So, for example, the biggest stigma that pops into my mind at the moment would be, well, aside from kind of, obvious criminal behaviours, like murder, rape, that kind of stuff, would be racism, right? Obviously, I know I'm not a racist person. I think it's a profoundly impractical way to behave. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to me. I don't get it. I don't get the appeal of racism. I never have done. But there's an enormous social stigma attached to that. People are very concerned about the idea of being called racist. So, when I was on air in South Yorkshire on Hallam FM, we had calls from people who were talking about asylum seekers. And they were telling us there was a problem in Rotherham with asylum seekers. Are you seeing where this is going yet? Well, I was conditioned to think that the sort of people that moan about asylum seekers, probably racists, right? That's what I thought. This would have been years ago now, around about 2002, 2003, something like that. And so a good 10 years ago. So I'm 28, I'm in my 20s, I'm a bit stupid. And what am I saying here? Well, the asylum seeker story that was, I don't think, ever pursued. Now, I wasn't a journalist at this point. I was a phone-in show presenter, and I didn't really chase stories full stop, to be honest. I'd just take them out of the papers. But that story, I think, was ignored partly because people had been conditioned to think anyone moaning about asylum seekers must be a racist. And as a result, the awful business in Rotherham, which has subsequently been revealed in detail by various journalists and campaign groups and so on and so forth, that whole story has come out, and I believe it was ignored by some journalistic organisations just because of that conditioning. The conditioning which goes, racist people are bad, so we must never ever communicate with them or talk to them about anything at all ever. Because of the stigma that surrounds them. Where's that come from? Well, it comes from conditioning. How does that conditioning come about? Well, I've talked about this before. I mean, the reason that we have conditioned our population in this country to reject racism, in my opinion, is inextricably intertwined with the Second World War. Yeah, we had an out-and-out racist, Adolf Hitler, bombing our country, right? We could see how massively out of control that belief system had got in Germany, and subsequent to the war, when it came out about the death camps and all that kind of stuff, it was obvious that racism was kind of a cancerous ideology. So, with good reason, we conditioned ourselves to stamp it out from this country as much as possible. And that starts in the universities and, the sort of the cultural, what would you call them? The cultural providers at the top of society, bleeds down into the current situation which we have now, where it's a social stigma to be racist. And I really haven't encountered many people that I would say were racist in my life. Not really. You know, I've encountered people who couldn't articulate themselves properly and ended up saying things which sounded racist that weren't, right? But an actual eugenics style, out and out, I believe this genetic pattern is better than that genetic pattern. It's pretty rare, isn't it? Am I alone in this? Have you met genuine racists? I haven't. I don't know. Maybe it's to do with projection. I mentioned to you before, racism's not a problem for me, so maybe I find it harder to spot in other people. Law of projection being the kind of the launch point for that. What are you talking about? Well, I'll just explain to the new listeners. The law of projection works like this. If you have something in you, you can see it without you. You know, if you're a drug addict, you can probably spot a drug addict. If you're an alcoholic, you can probably spot an alcoholic pretty quickly. You know how bullies often say, there's one thing I really hate, it's bullies, right? Why do you think they're saying that? Well, they're saying that because everyone's a hypocrite, because we see our faults in other people, because that's how we interpret and understand the universe. The law of projection, Google it, you've never heard of it. It's probably one of the most useful pieces of information in terms of self-help and self-improvement that I've ever encountered, because you want a list of your worst possible traits, you want to know the worst things about yourself. Here's how it works. Sit down and write out all the things you hate about everybody else. Right? You will then have you'll notice themes will start to build. And those themes that start to build will be reflective of your own personal issues. Yeah, I know. Annoying, isn't it? But that's just how it works. Anyway, there we go. Law of projection. I've waffled on, but as I mentioned, we've shifted the podcast across to Acast. Go to the main blog, thecultofnick.co.uk. If you can't find us, and then hopefully that'll be a way of you... how would you not be able to find us and then listen to me? I don't know. But thecultofnick.co.uk for more details. All right. See you next Tuesday.